Hey, you're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how to become the highest version of yourself so that you feel worthy of your craziest dreams and confident in your power to make them happen. My name is Ailey. I'm a coach and a Kundalini yoga and meditation teacher. This is episode 40, and it's about being on autopilot. I wanted to talk about this today because I found myself in that mode the other day, and it kind of surprised me. I was really in my head and not paying attention. And it was funny because at the end of the day, I was like, that's really interesting. I felt really disconnected from my emotional experience and from some of the decisions that I made on that day. And so I want to start off by sharing just a couple of questions that you might notice yourself asking when you're on autopilot or when you've just noticed that you've come off autopilot. So if you find yourself asking questions like, how did I get here? How did I end up here? Why did I do that? Or how did that happen? Even though you participated, that's a sign that you've probably been on autopilot in some capacity. And in my experience, being on autopilot is something that can happen in brief moments of time for little things where you aren't really paying attention to what you're doing or to what's happening in the moment. And it can also happen over longer periods of time, like years, for bigger things like relationships and career, where you aren't really paying attention to the trajectory of your life. So for the little moments, some examples might be like if you're driving somewhere and you're feeling rushed and you aren't really paying attention to the road. I mean, you're paying enough attention that you're not going to crash or anything like that. But when you get to the place that you've driven to, you're kind of like, how did I get here? And there's that element of not exactly remembering the trip. And another example of being on autopilot might be like if you're feeling rushed and you arrive at home and you're kind of putting your stuff down and you don't put it where you normally put it because you're in such a rush. And then when you're leaving, you don't find your keys because you're like, oh my God, where did I put them? And you didn't put them where you normally put them because you weren't paying attention. And then you can't find them. And then you're, searching for your keys and getting even more stressed out. And I think that for the bigger picture things, like the things where you aren't really paying attention to the trajectory of your life, those are things, for example, like if you've decided that the relationship that you're in is the one, you might ignore all the evidence to the contrary. Or if you've decided that this is it for your career, you stop paying attention to signs that maybe this isn't the best path for you. And one of the reasons that this can happen is because you've already pre-decided how you want something to turn out. So you ignore the signs and signals that indicate otherwise. Because trusting those signals and acting on them might mean that things don't turn out the way that you want them to. And so it's easier just to kind of stay in that autopilot mode and rationalize why you should ignore those instincts. Oprah has said a bunch of stuff about this, about paying attention to your life. Here's a quote from her. It whispers, and if you don't get the whisper gets louder. If you don't get the whisper when it gets louder, I call it like a little pebble, a little thump upside the head. The pebble or thump upside the head usually means it's gone into a problem. So going on autopilot happens when you're just going with the flow and taking the path of least resistance. So when you're not paying attention to the whispers or the pebbles or the thumps, you aren't really paying attention to what's happening. It's like you're just going through the motions. An autopilot is a passive mode where you're no longer fully in control of your decisions because they happen automatically and without a level of conscious intention because they're more based on ease and external factors and they're basically being made by default instead of by design because you're stuck in your head. So if you want to get off autopilot, it's really important to know what you want and how you want to feel so that you can make decisions accordingly. It's also important to learn how to be present and not get caught up in your head. Meditation and yoga are great ways of doing that. I'll put a couple of links to meditations in the show notes for you. You can find them at purelightpodcast.com under episode 40. And it's also important to investigate what led you to be on autopilot. So the next time that you notice that you've been on autopilot, like I was the other day, ask yourself, what instincts did I ignore? Because that's where you create the pattern of behavior of ignoring those whispers and ignoring the pebbles and letting things escalate to the point where it's not just the fact that you're not present, but it's also like, wow, my life really hasn't ended up where I want it to be. Because it's when you ignore those instincts that you kind of decide to check out and let your default decision-making take over. And the more that you do that, the more that you ignore your instincts, the more you'll end up on autopilot. So whenever you notice an opportunity to trust your instincts and act on it, take it, and you will take yourself off of autopilot. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you're listening. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.